The cross is, for all Christians, the focus of our relationship with Jesus Christ. The reason is that for Jesus, the cross was central to his life. It was the expression of his total love for his Father, his total commitment to the Father's will, and for each and every one of us. But there is something different in the Christian world when it comes to the cross. And that something different is understood and seen as how Catholics relate to the cross, and in fact, what is on the cross. This Good Friday's commemoration is a strong indication of this. Although the crucifixes are draped, we all know. For every Catholic church has a crucifix, not just a cross, or should have a crucifix. Most Catholic homes have a crucifix. There is even a crucifix on the altar. The cross, the crucifix, is all around us. It does have an effect on us if we in any way think about it. It has an effect on us to one degree or another, at a conscious or at an unconscious level. The Catholic Church from its beginnings has venerated the cross, but with the corpus on it, the dead body of Jesus. It's counterintuitive. Why? We Catholics keep the corpus on the cross because it reminds us that Jesus' sacrifice on Calvary fulfilled all requirements for satisfaction of God's justice, and there is a price for sin. Grace is not cheap because it costs the price of the blood of the Son of God. It's not cheap. But there is still a working out of that sacrifice, and that working out occurs in our lives. As St. Paul himself teaches, someone who was mentored by Jesus for many years in the desert and then a number of times in his earthly ministry. Colossians 1:24, I fill up in my own flesh what is lacking to the suffering of Christ for the sake of his body, the church. There are many effects that flow from the cross, that flow from Jesus Christ crucified, of which we are reminded when we look at a crucifix. The one that I want to focus on is resilience. Resilience. So what is resilience? An examination of the formal definition of resilience is enlightening. It's the ability to recover quickly from setbacks. The ability to recover quickly from setbacks. The connotation of resilience as applied to inanimate objects is useful to consider as well. It refers to the propensity to, quote, spring back quickly into shape after being bent, stretched, or squashed. Just think of that as it's spring now, and you step on grass, if it's green, what does it do? It bounces right back. So we say, well, grass is resilient to the weight of the human body. And there are many other things like that as well. Resilience is something that we can interiorize from our own family environment. When we come to know or learn a lot of our family's history, depending on what we learn, we can become more resilient to the stresses and pressures of life. Case in point, a New York Times article in 2013, researchers found that after September the 11th, the infamous, horrible incident where the towers were destroyed, a group of children, these researchers had already researched, they went back and studied them. They found that the ones who knew more about their families proved to be more resilient, meaning that they could moderate the effects of stress. Quote, the most beneficial narrative from this study is one called the oscillating family narrative. The oscillating family narrative. They use this example. "Dear," the mother says to her child, "Dear, let me tell you, we've had our ups and downs in our family. We built a family business. Your grandfather was a pillar of the community. Your mother was on the board of the hospital," so I guess this is Dad. "But we also had setbacks. We had an uncle who was once arrested. We had a house burned down on us. Your father lost his job. But no matter what happened, we always stuck together as a family, oscillating. Everything's not perfect here, oscillating." From a spiritual point of view, I'm in the midst of reading a spiritual biography of J.R.R. Tolkien, who served in the First World War. For those, I think, the few that may not know Tolkien, he wrote the Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, many other books, but those are his most famous. When he was in WW1, surveys were taken amongst Catholics and Anglican soldiers. This was required of the chaplains to do this. As one chaplain explained, quote, "The Catholic Church has so consistently preached the value of cross-bearing that pain and sickness do not lead to blasphemy and unbelief in the case of even ignorant Catholics." When I read that, I was actually surprised. But I wasn't. It's one of those, isn't that interesting? Later, this difference in handling of suffering and evil in preaching and religious formation goes some way to account for why the war, which was absolutely brutal and horrible, had a different effect on the spirituality of the average Anglican and the average Catholic. We Catholics sometimes are just not aware of how, and in many ways, the cross benefits us. The crucifix specifically, the cross, but the crucifix. All of us experience stress in our lives, every single one of us. All of us have ups and downs, and sometimes major ups and downs, and they do not always go away quickly. Some last days, weeks, months, years. Some are chronic, which means they'll never go away. What are we to do when we are going through these valleys of darkness? Sometimes, if they become too severe, we may actually have to seek out professional guidance, and we should. Having said this, we know from research that family stories can play a big part in helping people to be resilient. And all of this is outweighed by the power of the cross of Jesus Christ. There is some human suffering that is just too much for us to bear, it seems to us. This is when the cross of Jesus, it's not the only time, but especially when it's highlighted, when the cross of Jesus gives us a resilience that no human reality can. Jesus did not only get through bad times, but he overcame all the forces of darkness and the powers of hell. You can't get any worse than that. And death itself. Jesus didn't have to die. He could have simply willed the salvation of the world. He could have shed one tear and with its infinite value could have redeemed all of us. He didn't have to go through the death he went through, but he did, because you and I have to die. And so he said, I'm going to go ahead of you and I'm going to show you. I'm going to enter into the grave with you, and I'm going to show you that I have the power to walk out of it, and I will give you that power if you become my disciple. All too often in our society, people revert to a number of things that will divert attention from suffering or evil, to masking it with food, drugs, alcohol, the evil of pornography, working all of the time, busying ourselves in such a way that we don't really have to face it or deal with it, overindulging with the internet. People can very easily give in to rejecting God. The sad thing among many is that it makes things worse for us when we deal with it in this way. The evil doesn't change one iota. In fact, it might even get worse. And we very easily get caught into a loop where we think we cannot escape from it. In his new book, Build the Life You Want, The Art and Science of Getting Happier, Arthur Brooks gives us the science that to avoid suffering is to make it worse, to be more happy and to have learned nothing. So to avoid suffering, again, it's counterintuitive, but he actually shows it scientifically. To avoid suffering is to make it worse, to be more unhappy, and to have learned nothing. I'm just finishing up a podcast by Andy Stanley, who is interviewing Arthur Brooks. I highly recommend it. Very enlightening, talking about this new book. The way that Jesus Christ teaches us to deal with these things or realities, with these challenges of life, is to take up our cross, to ask him to help us open our heart, our mind, our emotions, and our soul to him, to his suffering and his victory over suffering and death. Resilience does not lead me to deny or reject suffering, or to deal with it like it is somehow a good in and of itself, because it's not. Rather, it helps me to deal with it, avoid the suffering that I can't avoid, of course. But it helps us to pass through it, to see that, in fact, with Jesus Christ on the cross, there is meaning in it if I offer it in union with him. In some way, just as the story of parents and grandparents can somehow get into, forgive the cheesy analogy, but get into the software of their children, get into their mind, the scientists would probably say something akin to neurons. It actually affects them and helps them to be more resilient. Jesus Christ actually can take the power of the cross and put it into us. He can infuse it into us by we hearing the stories over and over and over again of what he went through for us. That's in some way, I don't completely understand it, but we all understand the science of grandparents and parents telling their children about this oscillating story. Jesus tells us the truth, the story of how he overcame life and death. And that makes us more resilient. And so with that, I really encourage you to spend some time with Jesus crucified today in your prayer. Just spend time at the foot of the cross and ask Jesus to help you be more resilient with the cross or the crosses that you have, to offer it to God in union with him. Taking to ourselves the suffering and death of Jesus on the cross can help us, can help you to be resilient, to pass through these difficult and painful times in our lives, and only Jesus can and will give them meaning and value. We all find that a mysterious fruit of this is that we will be more resilient to the sufferings of our life, because we know that Jesus suffered with us and for us, and that he has triumphed, and promises us that if we will share in his triumph, if we remain faithful to him.